So this coming Sunday, we're kind of getting back on our normal schedule. We were 2 weeks ago we had the 30-hour famine, and then last week we did a movie night. So no real need to do previews and recaps for those. But last Sunday night we watched the movie Ruby Bridges, and it's a movie I had actually never heard of until my wife told me about it and we watched it. The story of Ruby Bridges, it's a true story, and on this one they actually stick very close to the actual story itself. They didn't really do a lot of changing or embellishing. And the reason they did that is that they didn't really have to. The story is pretty incredible all by itself. So Ruby Bridges was the first girl in New Orleans in the 1960s who attended a previously all-white school. And when she did, it sparked a series of protests and controversy, and it was a really ugly situation. So ugly to the point that she had to be escorted to school day after day after day after day after day by U.S. Marshals, escorted by vehicle and walked into school by protected by the U.S. Marshals. And she did. She'd walk through these lines of protesters who would yell incredibly awful things at somebody, especially for a young child. So it is, even for me, who was pretty familiar with U.S. history, kind of a shock as to what the 1960s and parts of the United States looked like. So I thought it was very appropriate for that reason. One, it gives a nice little history lesson. Number two, Ruby's faith is a huge part of the story. It's even recognized by the psychiatrist who she's working with to help process what's going on. It's a huge part of it. Quotes from Jesus throughout the movie, talk of faith, talk about enemies, just a lot of things come out in this movie that are deeply, deeply connected to our faith. In particular, there's one scene I want to focus on, though, that I think is especially appropriate for the audience that we have here at this church. And it's a scene, it's very short, it didn't get a lot of attention in the movie because in the grand scheme of things it's not that big of a deal. But one of the first girls to return to school after Ruby started attending. So when Ruby started attending, pretty much everyone pulled their kids out of school. And it was just Ruby going to the school. And it was basically just shut down. But one of the first kids who started going back to school, one of the first families to cross the protest lines, was a 34-year-old United Methodist pastor and his daughter, who were white. And there's a scene in this movie where Ruby's going into school, and you see this gentleman with a clerical collar on, and his daughter cross the protest line and begin to go into the school. And the marshals stop him and say, no, 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 you're not allowed to do that. And he said, look, I just want to take my daughter to school. And he walks her into school. The reason I think that that's a very significant point is that one of the concepts we find out about in Scripture is the idea of standing with people who are oppressed and suffering. And standing with is a concept that I think is really important for people to get, especially, I know, for me. So I'm only going to speak for myself. I know for me, as somebody who grew up in a very comfortable, very privileged position in life, right? I was born upper middle class, white parents, suburbia, access to good schools, access to a good college education, access to grad school, strong family system, for everything that I had, okay? For me, I know it had a big impact on helping me get to where I am today. And yet I know the value of, in my position, understanding that there was nothing I could do about that, right? There were other kids who didn't have that opportunity. There was nothing I could really do about that. I didn't necessarily have to feel guilty that I had had the opportunities that I did. But what came with the responsibility that I had, with the opportunities I had, was this idea of standing with, of standing in solidarity, of looking out for those who didn't have those same opportunities. So it's not about feeling bad about the opportunities you have, but of understanding your obligation and responsibility to stand with others who maybe didn't have those types of opportunities, to support them and to encourage them. Because that's a concept I think we've seen in Scripture over and over and over again. Throughout Old Testament, New Testament, we hear commands to look out for the widows and the orphans, right? Why widows and orphans? Because they had no one else to look out for them. To stand with them. To look out for them. In fact, James 1 tells us that is the true measure of true religion, is to care for the widows and the orphans. And I think for the kids in our youth group, many of whom are growing up very similar to how I did, this is a really important concept to understand, this idea of standing with, of understanding that God doesn't see race in the way that we do, right? God doesn't see us in different categories. We're all unique, we're all different, that's part of how God has created us. But that doesn't mean that any one of us are more or less a child of God because of what we look like or our physical abilities or anything like that. So what I want to talk about on Sunday night is the importance of standing with, of recognizing when people are in need. Now that doesn't just mean racial oppression or socioeconomic. It can just mean standing with people who are in need in a rough time. sometimes you'll go through something, and there's nothing that anybody else can do, right? If somebody in your family dies, there's nothing that I can do or anyone else can do to make that problem go away. But the concept of standing with somebody, being in solidarity with them, of supporting them, that's something that is at the very core of who the church is called to be, and who I think as disciples of Jesus we're called to be. So that gives you a little bit of an overcap of what I'll be a little bit of an overview of what I'll be talking about on Sunday at youth group. Next week, no youth group, as it's the spaghetti dinner, and sign-ups are going well for servers. If you're an adult and you have not signed up and your son or daughter is going on a mission trip this summer, you need to get signed up. This is one of our big fundraisers. It helps defray the cost for everyone. So we ask that everybody who can participate in the mission or in the spaghetti dinner in some way. If your son or daughter is not going on the mission trip, you are still welcome and encouraged to sign up, and many of you already have. If you have signed up, we'll be sending out a list of those assignments, and you can simply go onto a poll and confirm, yes, I know what I'm doing, no problem, no need to call me, I'll be there. So watch for all that early next week in the Youth News, probably sending all that information out on Tuesday. Until then, hope to see you on Sunday night, and enjoy the warm weather.